Good morning to our US colleagues who are joining us for our webinar on the Harmony with Strengths and updates on what has been happening in the China regulatory landscape since March this year. My name is Lucy and I work for Brandwood Biomedical as a regulatory consultant focusing on the Asia services. So if for those of you who are joining us from overseas, I guess because of the sound quality, to improve it, the best recommendation is to close all the other programs that may be competing with your internet traffic bandwidth. So if you can close all your browsers, it will hopefully help with a smooth streaming with our webinar. And yeah, just before we get into the actual material, I just want to do some housekeeping here. If you can see this orange button on the right-hand corner of your screen, there is actually a box for you to enter questions anytime during the webinar. So if there is anything that catches your attention, you want to follow on it, or you want to clarify something, feel free to enter the question here. Our staff will actually collect all the questions, and we should be able to have a couple of minutes to address them at the end of the webinar. So for those of you who have joined us previously on our March seminar with the same topic, don't worry, this is not the same one again. It's an update, so you don't have to laugh at the same jokes again. And CFDA has been working very hard to update all the regulations, so there's quite a lot of new material we'll be covering. And for those of you who this is your first time with us on the China webinar, don't worry, you don't need any prior knowledge of what's happening in China. This one will hopefully build from the foundation and give you an overview of what you need to know for entering the China market or continue in the China market. So let me start by telling you a little bit about Brandwood Biomedical. We're a consulting company that serves both the medical device and in vitro diagnostic sector. With offices in Australia, China, and New Zealand, we're focusing on supporting the Asia-Pacific region. Our expertise including pre-market strategy, as well as preparing and submitting your device registration for you, as well as post-market compliance, including compliance in holding local sponsorship. So why are we talking about China today? Well, firstly, China is a humongous market. As of September last year, its market, medical device market is estimated at US $17 billion, making it the fourth largest. And with a very high growth rate of 20% forecasted over the next 5 years, it's surely going to be quite a lot of opportunity for manufacturers from overseas and in China alike. It also has a very committed government in terms of healthcare spending. So we all know about Obamacare, but did you know that the Chinese government actually committed US $124 billion in phase 1 of its healthcare reform? So we have seen that money being put into China already to help it reach almost universal health cover, for instance. And right now we're in phase 2 of that program. So we're seeing more money being put in, about $64 billion to be committed by the year 2020. And that will see us with more clinics and better equipped clinics as well throughout China. So let's start by playing a little game. If I give you 3 pictures on the screen here, can you take a guess at where in the world this is? If you're looking at the left-hand side picture and recognizing the Eiffel Tower and promptly telling me it's France, you may have to take a look again. Because on this picture you can clearly see the scenery surrounding the Eiffel Tower is a bit different to what you would actually expect to see in Paris. This is because the mimic, this version on the left is actually a mimic built by a local developer in China to suit the European-themed residential complex. And similarly, the US people are very proud of their interstate highway system. And the same system has been adopted and also serving large parts of China in terms of connecting people and trafficking goods. If you remember the London Olympic Games, you may have memory of this Industrial Revolution thing. But those smoky chimneys are not just an Industrial Revolution thing in London. It's actually quite common to see that in modern Chinese villages, with all the developing that's happening and modernization China is trying to enforce throughout its land. So when you think of China, if you're still thinking of the old and ancient relics such as the Great Wall or the Forbidden Palace, that is actually fastly changing into a more modern society where China is actively trying to seek input from the Western world in how to build its modern cities. And this same landscape change is happening to the Chinese medical device industry. So we can see an effort from China last year, for example, by their formally joining the membership at IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. So together with 8 other member states throughout North America, South America, Europe, and some of the Asia countries, this group, IMDRF, is focused on bringing global harmonization to the medical device regulation. So as manufacturers, you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you go into a different market. And here I want to set the scene of what is the pyramid of the Chinese device regulation. So the top one is actually the Pharmaceutical Affairs Law that governs both the pharmaceutical products as well as medical devices. And for us medical device professionals, the key one to focus on is the regulation on medical device supervision and administration. So this regulation has actually been revised very recently, and as of March this year. And the new version has been enforced since 1st of June 2014. So it has only been in place for about 2 months. With the update to the regulation, there has been quite a number of changes needed in the supporting provisions. Closest to heart is probably the provision on medical device and IVD reagents registration. But these 2 provisions are actually still in draft. There has been 2 revisions on it since the first draft was published. So the rumor is the final version will be published in August so that's next month, and will be implemented from October this year. So it's quite important as manufacturers and stakeholders to be aware of what's coming down the track so quickly and to be prepared for it if you are trying to submit device registration or trying to prepare for device renewal in the next few months. As an overview of my talk, I'll start by presenting the pre-market process with a step-by-step guide through the basics of what you need to know and what the process is for entering device into China. And following that, I'll give you a quick overview of the post-market concerns, because China's new regulation is very focused on building the confidence in the whole device life cycle rather than just focusing on the pre-market step. There are always some special pathways that can potentially help you or hinder you, depends on your particular device type. So I'm going to touch on that as the ending point of my talk. And here is a road work sign for the pre-market stage. This is to remind you that because the provisions we just talked about, for the provisions for registration that is, are still in draft stage, everything I'm going to talk about today is obviously the most recent version and the most current thinking we understand from the agency. However, as regulatory consultants, we cannot guarantee what's going to be in the finalized version will be identical to the draft version. So it's very important that you understand things here may need to be verified in the finalized provision before you use it for your actual strategy work or put it as part of your pre-market dossier. So let's start with the pre-market section. Following the IMDRF, or the formal Global Harmonization Working Party guideline, China uses the same risk-based classification system. And with increased level of risk, there is also an increased level of regulatory control. This is evident by the framework set up in the new regulation that Class 1 device will only need document filing with the main elements of STED, but Class 2 and 3 device will need to be registered. That means they'll look into the technical aspect of your products more closely, and your device will need type testing in China, and there may be a requirement for in-China clinical trials moving forward. And we'll go into detail for each of those elements in this talk. So the starting point of any regulatory submission is obviously your classification. China uses a hybrid system where you have to refer to where there are elements of the US catalog-based system, the European rule-based system, as well as a whole combination and frequently updated market experience in China that all provide input to how devices are classified in China. So as a manufacturer, you have to be referring to 3 separate documents when you're classifying your device. The classification rules was published in the year 2000, and a whole number of catalogs were then introduced in the year 2002. And with technology innovation and new way of interpreting the rules and catalogs, there are case-by-case consultation that's published from CFDA to reflect what's the most recent thinking from the agency. The confusion may arise because of the different time period that these reference documents were published. When one does not correspond to another, it's very difficult to tell which one you should be going with. So as an example of that, we have a CPAP machine, the continuous airway pressure machine that's used to treat sleep apnea and so on and so forth. And it has it can be classified under 3 different catalog codes in China. Obviously, as a medical electrical equipment, it can fall under code 6821, and depends on where its user environment is supposed to be. It may be a patient ward equipment, or it could be used in the operation room as well. And you can see the risk classification associated with each of these catalog can be different. So as manufacturers, it's not very straightforward for you to be able to tell what classification your device really is. Now, to simplify that and to update the modern thinking and technology into the way devices are classified, we have a draft revision on the classification rules published last December. So in this revision, we can see a number of new elements, such as the introduction of the IVD reagent classification and the clarification on standalone medical software, as well as active implantable device and medical dressings. It also redefines the way that the classification of medical device kits or any principle for classifying any accessories that you may use with your device. So the future of classification system may more look like something that's represented on this graph here. So we are already seeing the publication of Class 1 catalog, and everything that falls into this catalog can apply with a new document filing pathway. Whereas even though the draft has not yet been published for the Class 2 and 3 version, we are expecting that Class 2 and 3 device to go through registration method, which is separate. But if your device is very new and innovative, it may not be mentioning any of the published catalogs, and that's when you may need to apply to CFDA directly to have your device classified. There is a suggestion in the new regulation that if you wish, you could also just apply for registration under the most stringent pathway, which is a Class 3 pathway here. I should also mention that even though the Class 3 and 2 catalogs aren't published, we can see a glimpse of it from the list of medical device exempted from clinical trial. Now this list, as the name suggests, is for a whole different purpose, but because of the way the draft was published, it's subdivided into the Class 2 and Class 3 sections, so that's why I say we have a glimpse of what's Class 2 and 3 from that list. Now I have briefly mentioned this, but the new filing system for Class 1 device was actually introduced on the 1st of June this year with the implementation of the new regulation. Now under the old system, the old regulation that is, Class 1s have to go through registration in very similar to Class 2 and 3 devices. Normally we would expect from the old system to the new system there will be a transition period for manufacturers and applicants to understand the difference and to really familiarize themselves with the new requirements. However, we have been surprised actually that the new ways of filing Class 1s were published on the 30th of May, 2 days before it was enforced. So CFDA actually required all Class 1 application that was undergoing review to be withdrawn and resubmitted. And that obviously probably caused quite a bit of concern for anyone who had registration going through at that time. On the other hand, for the old registration pathway for Class 2 and 3 device, this is a sort of an overview on a flow chart. From everything from translation to the drafting of your Chinese product dossier to in-China type testing, which is required for Class 2 and 3 device, and the CFDA process from submission to approval, in theory could take about 9 months. For anyone who has actually handled a registration project in China, this timeline may just seem too good to be true. And that is mainly because the technical evaluation phase can be unpredictable, with the reviewers coming back with multiple rounds of questions and seeking manufacturer's input. So in the proposed device registration pathway, we have seen two main elements, that is the product standard dossier and in-China type testing changed slightly into a requirement for China's DED file, and the new default being the in-China clinical trials after type testing is completed. So the timeline is, the announced timeline, I should say, in the draft revision is draft provisions are that CFDA review should take roughly about 8 to 10 months. And because of the way that the new requirement is for more documents to be provided in this Chinese DED file, so we are hoping, unlike the Class 1 transition, which happened fairly quickly and unexpectedly, we're hoping to see more of a transition period allowed for Class 2 and 3 device. But there's no formal confirmation yet on the implementation timeline or the transition period allowable from CFDA. So right now we're watching this space quite closely, which is why I guess it's very good to understand what is expected in a Chinese DED file. So common to both medical device and IVD reagents are the elements shown on the screen here, with your risk evaluation report, your product specification, your quality control and testing report, and the clinical evaluation. Depending on the level of risk, you may be expected to have a summary or more detailed version of the manufacturing process involved. And for any device selling in China, obviously, and actually for the whole regulatory submission, you're supposed to provide information in simplified Chinese only. So that also applies for the Chinese labeling, as well as the translation of all the what's already in your European STED file or the US DMR DHF into Chinese to compile the Chinese STED. And now separately, we have some variation between medical device and IVD reagents. And you may notice here that I use IVD reagents rather than IVD device. That is because IVD device in in Europe and US typically covers the analyzers and equipment that's used for in vitro diagnostics. However, in China, those kind of instruments and analyzers are treated as medical devices. So here in the provision, in the draft provision for medical device registration, we have seen in the introduction of a excuse me, essential requirements checklist. So this list is largely based on the European and IMDRF essential requirements. And supporting the essential requirements, there is obviously the need for preclinical verification and validation. So the internal type testing report is always required for Class 2 and 3 and will be required in the new framework. And for medical devices and IVD reagents, the draft provision actually does touch on the clinical trial reports and certain criteria to justify an exemption from clinical trials. So as always, the devil is in the details. For IVD reagents, it has been required that 3 consecutive batch has to be used for type testing in China if your device is of the Class 3 classification. And but overall, I would say that IVD reagents has seen relatively fewer change compared to medical devices. So for those of you who have not previously dealt with the CFDA or the China market, you should be aware that China actually has introduced a whole number of standards and largely adopted from the international version. So for example, the biocompatibility standards, the international ISO 10993 series has been translated and largely identical to the national standards GB 16886 series in China. So as manufacturers, when you're drafting your own product specification, you are expected to refer to all the applicable national and industrial standards to demonstrate your compliance with them. So largely this is great news because as most US and European manufacturers have already got quite a good record for complying with international standards when they're getting their approval from the market of origin. However, there is a small catch in that the Chinese standard is not always the most up-to-date version. A classic example of this that I have used in the past and will still use it again is the medical electrical safety requirements we know as IEC 60601-1. So China, the most up-to-date version in China is actually the 2nd edition. And the rest of the world, I believe, has mostly moved on to the 3rd edition of this requirement. Even though I'm not a technical expert in how to comply with electrical safety requirements, I understand that if you developed and tested your products only to the 3rd edition, you may have quite a bit of trouble demonstrating compliance with the 2nd edition. So that could be a major obstacle for you when you're going through in-China type testing and have to demonstrate compliance to their version, which is the 2nd. Another way that it may catch international manufacturers is in the Chinese way of interpreting and enforcing these standards. So as I mentioned, with the update, the draft version of the updated classification rules, there actually has been a technical detail in the defined scheme as uncompromised surface only. So we actually had a reviewer coming to us when we are trying to register a medical hydrogel dressing. She asked us for more extensive biocompatibility testing that's only commonly seen for implants. And her rationale was that because these medical dressings are for wounds that breach the dermis, hence they are high-risk class and they are not intended for uncompromised skin, and therefore they should require more extensive biocompatibility record than test that's intended for skin as uncompromised surface. So obviously the underlying issue here is a lack of training, and it's understandable when so many things are changing and happening in such a short period of time. The reviewers will need time to catch up on how they would interpret and enforce the new rules and standards and regulations in actual life. So talking about type testing, here are a whole list of different type testing centers that you may be able to go with. As overseas suppliers, you can choose any of the provincial level or municipal level testing houses, and each of these testing houses actually has its own area of expertise. So some may be better with active device, others may be better with dealing with biocompatibility. And depending on the expertise, the timeline for completing type testing and the extent of exemption they are willing to allow really varies from center to center. We have discovered that generally if the testing house does not have the time and does not have the required equipment, and given the that the standards that you need to test against is equivalent between your international testing reports and the Chinese most recent standards, they would generally allow you to use that overseas report you have already, the translated version, to exempt yourself from in China type testing of the same testing item. But they will still obviously do some verification testing on just simple and easy to process type of testings. So with the introduction of clinical trial requirements, you need to be aware that only products that has passed this type testing in China can be used for recruiting patients into in-China clinical trials. And clinical data requirements is probably the quite key to most people's registration plan, because previously most class 2 and 3 device, this is medical device only, medical device manufacturers can use their overseas clinical evaluation report or clinical data to support the in-China registration. But under the draft provision, we have seen a change in that the new default will be the in-China clinical trials for each different kind of devices, and only a selected few that's included in the list of exempted devices I mentioned earlier will be able to be exempt and continue to use their overseas evaluation or report or clinical trial data to apply for Chinese registration. Now the situation is actually a bit different for IVD reagents in that I think since 2007, even under the previous provision, the expectation has always been that class 2 and 3 reagents will have in-China clinical trial data to complement the overseas clinical evaluation report they have obtained. The only exempted device is still is a class 1 for both medical device and IVD reagents. Because these are going through the filing method, the FDA will not look into the way that clinical evaluation report is written. At least that's what they said in the provision for class 1 filing methods. So how do we know that whether your device, a particular device, is exempted or not from clinical trial in China? The list of exempted medical devices and IVD reagents, as promised in the draft provisions, are the gold standards for measuring against. And there has been, through gathering public feedback, there has been actually a change in that medical devices, this is excluding IVD reagents, not included in this list, may still apply for exemption based on data from the same kind of device. So this allows, it gives hope to medical device manufacturers, and depending on how well you can argue that you have data from the same kind of device already, you may be, even though you're not on this list, you may be exempted. However, we have heard that the most recent discussion regarding IVD reagents shows that CFDA is unlikely to allow this for IVD reagents, and more so that they may even scratch the IVD reagents altogether from the list of exempted devices. So that would mean that IVD reagents will maintain the status quo, which is you always do require clinical trial in China to complement your device registration. So here's a couple of things you need to be aware of clinical trial in China. Firstly is this faded and this sort of background picture is actually a provision on good clinical practice, and there's a version particular to medical device, which is quite similar to ISO 14, the international ISO version. But there is also another one that's particular to IVD reagents that you need to be adhering to. And in China, there are different levels of hospitals. So some hospitals are more qualified than others to do clinical trial. And right now, I think most medical devices and IVD reagents actually look up the drug, the pharmaceutical list of qualified hospitals, and largely use the same kind of treatment area and level of, and needs to have sort of AAA rating before you can commission them to run your clinical trial. The highest risk devices, that is mostly your implantable, active implantable device, needs to actually have approval before you can conduct your clinical trial, for your clinical trial plan, before you can start to conduct patient recruitment. And for the other kinds of devices and reagents, you generally need to notify the local local FDA office, so they understand that you are you're conducting trials in their jurisdiction. The question mark next to the QMS requirements is from this clause in the enforced regulation that for conducting clinical trials you need to verify the authenticity of the prototypes. Generally, for domestic manufacturers coming up with clinical trial plans, that means they need to have an on-site audit of their design control as well as design dossier before CFDA would allow them to continue with the clinical trials. But for overseas manufacturer, it's still a question mark on what level of evidence is required for this authenticity verification. So once you have completed clinical trial, you essentially should have all the documents from the Chinese STED, the type testing report, and clinical trial reports generated by hospitals. You're ready for CFDA submission. And under the old registration pathway, for class 1 to 3 devices, the manufacturer would compile everything into a dossier and give it to CFDA for review. The CFDA reviewer would then come back with a list of questions for the manufacturer to provide more information on. The only problem is this cycle of question and answer may have to go on for quite a while before you are granted the application, you're able to pass through the review process and be granted with the registration certificate. So our worst case record is still a client that has had their application, a class 3 application, stored in this review question and answer for about 3 years before they came to us for professional help. However, under the new filing pathway for class 1, it's expected that the manufacturer will give all the Chinese stat file information to the CFDA, and the CFDA will only check for completeness and will not raise any technical questions before allowing them to go on and market their device in China. Not quite so straightforward for class 2 and 3, but the good news is after you're submitting all the type testing and clinical trial data, if required, and the Chinese STED, the CFDA reviewer should only be giving you one round of review questions for you to provide supporting data on. So that gives quite a bit more predictability into your registration timeline than the previous multiple question and answer cycle potential. Of course, with any regulatory process, the key questions are how long it will take and how much will it cost me. So on the timeline, we have seen from the draft provision that everything from CFDA submission to technical review and responding to technical review second round after receiving review question answers, as well as application finalization and issuing of certificate, should roughly take about 8 months for Class 2 device and roughly 10 months for Class 3. Of course, this timeline does not count any time required by the manufacturer to gather evidence to respond to the review question, nor does it cover any time spent by the expert committee review, which is only, I guess, is an optional pathway to the reviewers if they feel that your device needs additional expert advice on its safety or effectiveness. So I don't quite have dollar figures here for the cost side of things, but what I do have is a sort of title page, if you like, for your budget. As you can see, the Chinese stat file has quite a long list of documents required. So associated with that is a translation cost for them to be translated from your original language into simplified Chinese. The type testing centers and clinical trial hospitals will likely have a fee associated with testing or running clinical trial for your device. And as of 1st of June, under the new regulation, CFDA is now authorized to collect registration fees from manufacturers, from overseas manufacturers, which previously they haven't been allowed to. But we have not seen any draft or recommendation on how much exactly this is going to cost you. And we will go into a bit more detail, but you will need probably support from a China sponsor or registration agent, and that has dollar signs associated with it as well. But obviously the last component, as with any project, is an unexpected cost when you have, for example, reviewers requesting you to retest certain aspects of your device. Then you have to allow additional time and money for that. So the Chinese agents are there because most foreign manufacturers, when they deal with regulators in China, they don't have to do it directly, and they're not expected to. You normally have to appoint some in-China sponsor and agents to act on your behalf. So here is a breakdown of the 3 types of agents you have to be aware of. Most importantly is your local sponsor. Even though these are not the license holder of your device, that means, once you get the registration license, you're still allowed to change your local sponsor sort of without their necessary consent. But they do act on your behalf, so if there is anything that CFDA wants to contact you on post-market, for example, with your device, then they will contact the local sponsor as the first port of call. The local sponsor, if they don't have the regulatory expertise, would typically go to a registration agent to get the device registered in China. So the registration agents, that's part of our service. We can act on behalf of the sponsor to interface with the CFDA, and obviously for any agent you appoint for that role, they need to have good regulatory competency and also a good working relationship with CFDA, because when their name appears on the registration dossier, CFDA may sort of judge the quality and truthfulness of your dossier depending on the reputation of the agent you use. An after-sales agent comes into play more after you get the product supplied and registered and start supplying in China. And they're typically your distributor, because they're the guys that can provide technical support on the ground, and typically they also get the first notification for adverse event reporting from hospitals or clinics. And their role is quite important in keeping the local sponsor as well as the manufacturer informed of these adverse events, so that you can report them in turn to the CFDA on time. And now in summary, we have three key elements in making a submission in China. The first one is to prepare well and prepare early. The second is, due to all the changes that's happening, really do verify the pathway and requirements before you execute registration project. And thirdly is you have to partner with the trustworthy agents and someone who has a well-functioning relationship with the FDA. And if you do all that, hopefully in due time you receive the registration certificate. That's when your sales team start to project good sales figures and people opening bottles of champagne to celebrate. And that's great news. However, that's not the end of regulatory compliance in China. You have to keep in mind that the certificate itself does not guarantee you the life happily ever after. So it's very important to keep in mind what you have to observe in the post-market phase. And if you allow me to use some mobile phone game analogies here, the prior 2014 regulation sort of had the view of an Angry Birds model when it comes to post-markets. So you have to use your ammunition or resources very carefully at the sort of front end of the whole registration phase. So that's when you aim the birds here very carefully to hit the target and get the device approved and registered, and then you're going to be successfully over the line and up on to the next level. However, that is not the case moving forward in the new regulation, which focuses on a whole life cycle management. It is more a Flappy Birds model, where you have to keep monitoring and keep reacting to the up and downs that could happen in the supply and distribution of your market, of your device in the China market. So in less tricky terms, this is what happens prior to 2014 when you have a product variation application. The Angry Birds model says you need all the new registration documents and as well as some post-market reports to file a product variation. So you can see from this that the product variation is as stringent, if not more stringent, than registering new devices in China. And that could be frustrating when you have a device with perfectly safe market records and relatively few or relatively minor changes to take out. So to counter that, since January this year, CFDA has already introduced a number of ways to simplify what's called a re-registration submission or variation submission. So for simple variations or for simple certificate renewal without variations, you can be exempted from type testing, which is a big cost element and time it takes time as well from your registration efforts. And this principle is also adopted in the proposed post-market pathway in our draft provisions. So you can see that there are three different catalogs of how to file for post-market application. Simple certificate renewal and administrative variations can be processed without technical input and relatively quickly as well. Whereas for technical variation, the new focus will be on risk assessment, and that means you only have to review and you only have to submit what is changed in your product. But the only question that remains is how major the change needs to be before you're required to provide additional type testing and or additional clinical data to support that. So remembering the Flappy Birds model, we have a few elements to look out for in the ongoing monitoring of your device. As the manufacturer, you need to trust your sponsor to submit the annual post-market reports on time, as well as report any adverse event reporting, any adverse events in the market promptly and in compliance with the Chinese requirement. As a manufacturer, you need to be keeping your continual compliance with the GMP requirements, and for most of us that means the ISO 13485 certificates needs to be you need to be adhered to and keeping valid. For in China manufacturers, they are going to be audited and unannounced, and it's going to be risk-based depending on how complex and how risky their device is. However, no matter you are overseas or in China, CFDA does of their own initiative raise certain reviews for particular groups of device or areas of focus, typically as an outcome of certain adverse events or certain reports of that has generated bad publicity in China. They also randomly sample device in the post-market phase to test that they're still complying to the product specification that they're registered with. So your supplier or your distributor is not exempted from the ongoing monitoring phase either, because they need to be certified and in compliance with the good supply practice in China. And if their warehouse or supply chain is found to be faulty by CFDA, then your continuity of business may similarly be affected. And as a final remark, I want to just touch on some special device categories, because in the medical device sector, we always have technology leading regulation. So CFDA has published the special review and approval procedure for innovative devices in February this year. And as part of this innovative device procedure, if you have your Chinese patent or well on track to get your Chinese patent, and you have applied good design control and has a good design history file, then you can apply and take advantage of certain privileges under this fast-track approval. For instance, you'll have a single contact person to coach you and manage the whole review process with you. So that's certainly going to help you navigate a lot of pitfalls that may happen if you don't have that kind of guidance. You'll get advanced feedback from type testing centers on the technical aspects of your product. And if your product is not yet in a classification category, that can be decided in parallel with the technical review. And what's more, your product technical review is going to be prioritized over the others, because they're allocated to a special team of experts specifically appointed by the Office of Innovative Device. Yep. So here we have already the lucky first applicant that has gone through this and being deemed successful and needs to go through this fast-track pathway. So it's an absorbable durasealant, and since this announcement in mid-May, we have seen more devices coming from being announced as successful candidates and are now going through this fast-track approval process. So what CFDA does is they always publish the decision for a period of time, roughly about 2 weeks, so other manufacturers and industry can judge on whether the device is truly innovative enough and the first of its kind in the field. The other aspect is on the reprocessing of single-use device. I've chosen this as an example to show the change and update that has happened between the old and new regulation framework. It's obviously not the only change that has happened, but because of the new use of old technology, the reasons for total prohibition of reprocessing of single-use device seem to have partly gone away for China. And instead of the total ban on reprocessing, they are now going to allow certain category of device to deem them reprocessable. So if your device is single-use only, then moving forward you need to observe certain label requirements. You need to have higher level of vigilance, and you must destruct your device after use and keep the hospitals and clinics need to keep good destruction records. However, if you are the reprocessor, then the reprocessor is actually deemed the legal manufacturer in China and has to observe the regulation in the same way that the original manufacturer does. So this creates an interesting scenario where the draft provision in the Europe MDD directive actually has reprocessing of single-use device as mostly low to moderate risk, whereas the same kind of device in China are typically mid to high risk and potentially needing clinical trial to get registration. And as reprocessors, you may be exempted in Europe from holding conformity assessment. But in China, you have no such explicit exemption. So how to show evidence of, for example, the mandatory market of origin approval, it's going to be quite interesting for an European reprocessor. And as a summary of my talk, we have clearly seen with the new regulation as well as the draft provisions, an effort from CMDA from CFDA to harmonize their overall process and documentation requirements. There is in general an increased rigor for high-risk device registration as well as post-market. And a lot of change we're still seeing happening in this high growth environment is going to probably cause a number of growth pains in areas such as reviewer training and how exactly does things need to be processed will be probably a bit questionable and needs to be coped with fairly promptly by the manufacturer. But with time, I think we're going to still see a general harmonized way with medical device registration in China that is beneficial to all the imported device manufacturers. So with that, I will open the floor to questions and any comments from the audience on your own experience or potentially your own interpretation of how the regulation is going to work in the future. And also to mention that you can actually come and meet us at any of these 3 events in the next month or 2. We're going to be attending the CIMDR in Xiamen next month, as well as the BioUtah event in Utah, USA. We're also occupying a booth 141 in Texas at the REPS annual conference in September. So yeah, come and say hi if you happen to be at any of these events. Right, so I have a list of questions here. The first one is from Xiao Qing. And the question is, do you know if the validity period of a testing report is going to be extended due to the fact that clinical trials has to occur after type testing? Yeah, so I think the scenario Xiao Qing is trying to present is if you have a class 2 or 3 device that has already gone through or is currently going through testing, type testing in China, and you're not yet sure or you think that clinical trial will be required when the new provision is implemented. So under that scenario, the typical way is obviously I should say the written general requirements is that type testing reports are only valid, I think, for a year after they're issued. But obviously clinical trials can, depending on how fast you can organize and run it, can easily take that period of time. So we're going to have to watch, as far as I know, CFDA has not yet specified any details on this validity period or on any transition period allowance for the next few months. So this is a question I think CFDA is probably still figuring out, and we'll have to check when the finalized provision for registration is published. And for the benefit of those who joined a bit later, if you want to ask a question, you can just see the orange button on the control panel, and there is a box there for you to type your question in for our staff to collect and we can respond to. And the next question is from Julie. How many years is the certificate good for? So how many years is the registration certificate going to be valid? So that used to be 4 years, but the new regulation has allowed 5 years validity period for anything that's approved after the 1st of June. And for class 1s, because they're now not going to be registered but only needs renewal, only needs filing, I have not seen an explicit requirement for their renewal, but rather any significant changes to the documents that you file with CFDA. It needs to be kept, and you need to keep CFDA informed as the changes happen. And the next question is on what about current licenses on class 1, 2, and 3? When do manufacturers have to re-register under the new regulation? So there hasn't been any explicit requirement for you to need to re-register it sooner than the expiry date. So my assumption would be you can continue use the current license until they expire, or actually 6 months before they expire, and that's when you need to obey the new rules and do class 1 filing or class 2 and 3 registration. Of course, the other thing you have to take into consideration is if your class 2 or 3 device happen to be something that is needing clinical trial and all that, then the time period needs to be taken for renewal may be a bit different depending on how CFDA is going to allow this transition to occur. So I would say that's also a detail that we need to look to CFDA when they publish the transition sort of arrangements later this year. And here I have a comment from Dave on the class 1 registration they had that was, he said, abruptly ended when the 1st of June announcement came through. And he said this is quite a frustrating experience because of the suddenness, and whether he's questioning whether that had been any prior warning and whether any prior warning is going to be allowed for class 2 and 3 device. So yeah, Dave, we definitely hear you on the frustration you had with class 1. We similarly had a number of registrations going through at the time of the announcement, and I can tell you that no, there wasn't any prior warning that or registration under review was going to have to withdraw and resubmit for filing. So yeah, we also had to sort of talk to the industry, and we were actually able to call on a few industry contacts to get a submission into CFDA on to propose that they should allow manufacturers to have the flexibility of changing or choosing their own way of going forward, whether to continue with the registration or whether to withdraw and apply for filing. But unfortunately, up to date, we still have not yet heard from CFDA on how they on any feedback to our submission. Yeah. And the next question is from Simon on whether there should be any whether that clinical trial exemption has been any examples of that. So the clinical trial exemption is actually in the draft provisions, and the list is yet to be finalized. So up to the time of preparing this, we still only have the knowledge of what's drafted and not yet, obviously, until they are finalized and published, we won't have a good case of applying for exemption and obtaining exemption. So that's something we'll need to look forward to later this year with the published version of the provision. And with that, thank you very much for your attention, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed the seminar. And with that, I'll close the webinar, and yeah, have a good day.